welcome back, guys. I hope everyone is having a great week. I'm gonna work on chapter 12 today. Tried to get to that yesterday, but I ran out of time, unfortunately. So we're gonna pick up with it today. Not gonna lie to you, I love teaching this chapter. This is one of my favorite ones to teach. Personality in general. It's been a big passion for me whenever it comes to psychology. So I always really enjoy teaching this. With that being said, too, another reason that I love teaching this is there's going to be a lot of prominent names dropped, a lot of really important psychological theories discussed, things like that. So in the grand scheme of things, this chapter is very important, and expect that importance to be reflected in the test. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Hopefully you get what I'm saying here. Not to say that obviously I'm going to test on the other chapters in this module too, but expect to see more from this chapter probably than any of the others. Because this really is the basis of a lot of psychological understanding and the theoretical framework for a lot of psychological concepts. So know that and kind of understand that and kind of keep that in mind as we go through this chapter, because it is very, very important. One of the other things that I love about it is that I get to teach it a lot. I love doing that. I get to teach it in this class as well as my CLP course that I teach. So this is material that I'm very, very familiar with, very, very comfortable with, and I welcome a challenge. So, enjoy it, ask questions, kind of go along with it. And, especially for anyone who is thinking about a career in psychology or education, we're going to be discussing a lot of really important stuff here. So keep that in mind as we go through the chapter. Again, as usual, please don't hesitate to ask questions. But yeah, chapter 12, talking about personality. The easiest way for me to define personality is a set of enduring traits. So most of you guys by now have had some sort of interaction with me, be it email or discussion board or coming by my office to meet me, whatever it may be. But in any capacity in which you've dealt with me, you can probably kind of understand my personality. I tend to be more laid back. Not to say that I don't have my boundaries, but given courteous response and respect, I tend to be more flexible than maybe some others that you may know, some other professors, maybe even some friends. I tend to be pretty easygoing and pretty laid back. So, and that's part of my personality. Anytime you see me in a tizzy or up in arms, you kind of know, oh, well, that's not like her. I wonder what's going on. And that's kind of what personality is. It's textbook definition, a pattern of enduring distinctive thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that characterize the way an individual adapts to the world. So kind of how you see the world, how you understand it, what has caused that, your thoughts, feelings, things like that, and the responses that you have in kind of response to that. So hopefully that is pretty clear. Again, for brevity's sake and for the simplicity of understanding, I tend to go with a set of enduring traits and accompanying behaviors. So they tend to persist throughout the lifespan. They do change in accordance to individual experiences, growth, and maturity, but overall they tend to be fairly stable. From one person to go from kind of a hot mess up to a highly organized type A individual doesn't really happen too often. Tends to be more of a middle ground, and a drastic change is fairly uncommon, barring any sort of traumatic brain injury. That's really where you see personality change. We talked about Phineas Gage earlier in the semester. His personality changed in response to his head injury. For the most part, that is really when you're going to see a huge change in people. This manifests through consistent behavior in various situations. So a lot of you guys have had, maybe you've had something going on and you're like, hey, I haven't been able to get my quiz. Most of the time I'm like, it's cool, I understand. Or is everything okay? Here's an extension. Okay. One day you email me and you're like, I'm really sorry, something bad happened, or I had family in town. And I'm like, well, that's just too bad. I'm sorry. You're like, whoa, what happened? Because my behavior is inconsistent. Normally I'm okay. Normally I'm laid back. So for me to be all of a sudden, well, I'm sorry, it's 11:59. No, you can't start it now. I'm sorry, it's just late and I'm not going to accept it. We do know that there are some people like that, but that's not what you expect from me because you've come to learn my personality. So, psychodynamic theories, these are probably the most influential, or either maybe a better way to look at it is the most popular whenever it comes to understanding personality. A lot of times we also call this psychoanalytic perspective. Again, I think I mentioned this in the very first lecture that I ever recorded. Maybe it was lecture 2, I don't know. Anytime you hear psychodynamic or psychoanalytic, think of Freud, okay? So, all theories descended from Sigmund Freud. You're talking about psychodynamic or psychoanalytic. He was a physician specializing in neurology. He had a very specific clientele, and he had a very specific way of conducting his business, and that led to a lot of really interesting findings, but also it caused a problem in that it is very difficult for us to test this because a lot of it was just extended conversations with people. And how do you replicate that? How do you test that? You can't really. So lengthy verbal interactions, deep probing into the lives of his patients, that culminated in psychoanalysis. Now, we have something called the structural theory of personality. This is what I personally refer to as the iceberg theory. And it starts out with levels of consciousness. So he compared personality to an iceberg. And in it, it's a giant block of ice floating in water. So with that, part of that was sticking out of the water. You have the very tip of the iceberg. And that's what he called your conscious. And your conscious is something that you know all the time. If I ask you your name, you don't have to think about that. You know that. It's automatic. Things that are easily recalled, things that are very easily accessible, and can contact the outside world and can be communicated clearly. Your preconscious is kind of the shallow part of the water. So right underneath the conscious, that is not to say that it is accessible for all the world to see or understand, but that it can be recalled. So one of the things that I like to use with that, it can be recalled with effort. It does take a little bit of thought and a little bit of effort. So this isn't something that you think about every single day, but you can bring up when you need to. So if I ask you about your first vacation, where did you go? What did you do? What do you remember? You know, you guys may be like, oh, I hadn't thought about that in a while. That's your preconscious. It's not something that you exhibit in everyday activities, or may not be something that the rest of the world knows about you inherently, but it is something that you can think about and talk about when provoked or prodded or prompted. That's the right P word I was looking for. Okay. You're unconscious. This is the deep part of the iceberg. These are things that you may not necessarily be able to recall. Thoughts, memories, and desires below the surface of conscious awareness, but still influence thoughts, behaviors, and attitudes. This is what Freud was really into. What happened as a child? You know, what do you remember? What kind of relationship did you have with your parents when you were a baby? Things like that. And Freud thought that impacted our behavior as much as anything else. He really stressed the importance of that. So if you and your father did not have a good relationship when you were a child, that he thought that you would be able to see that in your current interactions, in your everyday world, and in your environment. So it's not something that you necessarily think about or that you can even recall. A lot of times when you're babies, you can't recall things that happened when you were a baby. But he still believed that this helped shape your personality. For Freud, he thought that the personality was formed by the age of 5. Popular theories disagree with that because of development. You know, a lot of things happen. You don't stop changing and growing and evolving after the age of 5. But for him, he thought you had a pretty good solid foundation. Now, the fun part. The id, the ego, and the superego. If you notice, there's a picture of Homer on the slide. We're on slide 5. If you're following along the book, we're on page 395. And these are kind of your moral components of who you are. So, your id is very basic and very primitive. That's why there's only 2 letters to it. Everything that you want, all of your desires, stem from your id. So, you go out for a night on the town, and you see your ex's car in the parking lot, and the little voice inside of you is like, kid, slash their tires, and you're like, yeah. It was a bad breakup. So you have these urges or these impulses, and all of those things come from your id. In Homer's case, it's sure eat the forbidden donut. Operates off the pleasure principle. If it's something that's going to make you happy and bring you joy, it's coming from your id. Obviously, we can't listen exclusively to our id. How many of us would be arrested and or dead from doing something stupid? It happens. So you have some mitigating factors in there. Kind of counter to the id is your superego. Whenever I think of this, I think of Superman, truth, justice, and the American way. Yay! Honesty, integrity, all of those good things, everything that's moral and right. So you see your ex's car in the parking lot whenever you go out for a night. Your id says, kid. Your superego goes, no, you can't do that. You're going to get arrested. Or, wow, that's a really jerk move. Don't do that. Because, how would you feel if someone keyed your car? You'd be upset. And your superego, it kind of acts as your balance. It says, your id has these very primitive desires. Your superego is what keeps you oftentimes from acting on them, or gives you the converse or opposite side of it. So for Homer in the forbidden donut analogy, it is the little angel part of him who is like, no, don't eat the donut, go to heaven, that kind of deal. So how do we choose? How do we choose between our id and our superego? Welcome to us. This is our ego. This is what we use to make decisions. The ego is your decision-making component of your personality. And it operates according to the reality principle. Is my ex a jerk? Yes. Does that mean keying his car is the right thing to do? No. So it kind of offers that compromise. It acknowledges the id, but also gives you different alternatives, and maybe somewhere middle ground perhaps between the id and the superego. So it'll offer alternatives, problem-solving strategies, things like that. So hopefully that's clear. If not, let me know. Going along with structural theory, the Freudian structure of personality consisting of unconscious drives, that is the individual's reservoir of sexual energy. Whenever we talk about sexual energy or sexual impulses, whenever it comes to Freud and these structures of personality, one thing that you need to understand is that it's not just sexual, as in copulation or intercourse. Whenever he talks about these things, he's talking about behaviors that are mitigated and controlled by society. And that includes not only sex, but violence as well. You can't just go around beating up or killing people that you don't like, contrary to what today's news may tell you. You can't. So what Freud wanted to look at was, why do we have these desires to do the things that we do? And why is it so important that society keeps these things in check? So the superego we talked about serves as the harsh internal judge of our behavior, often what we call the conscience, and the ego, the Freudian structure that has to work off the reality principle and actually make decisions. All right, defense mechanisms. I'm going to go through these really quick. Kind of one thing that I did. Okay. The next 3 slides are on defense mechanisms. I think the examples are really the best part of it. So repression. Repression is trying to block out or not think about something. And a lot of times this is something that happens with trauma that will block it out, will make it something that is not easy to recall or will not be thought about or will not be talked about. Kind of the example of that is a soldier not remembering an IED attack. Obviously, there's a lot of trauma that goes along with that, so they don't want to think about their colleagues that died. They don't want to think about all of the pain that they felt after the adrenaline had worn off and they felt all the injuries. So what do? They push it in the back of their mind so that it's not easily recalled. The problem with that is that thoughts somewhat demanded to be processed sometimes. So a lot of times with repression, it will come out and kind of seep out into our everyday reactions in painful, obtrusive ways. Projection. So attributing one's own thoughts and feelings or motives to another. There was a really great question on the quiz about this. I was talking about this couple who has a dinner party and the man accuses his wife of being attracted to their male neighbor or whatever, but it's really because he's attracted to the female neighbor. One of my favorite examples of this are jealous significant others. Kind of that whole, they're accusing you of doing it because it's something that they've thought about and they feel guilty about it. So they take that guilt and they put it onto you. They think, oh, well, you're the one who wants to do this, or this is what you're thinking, or this is what you're doing. You're cheating. But maybe it's because either they're cheating or they're thinking about cheating. So they take their feelings that they can't deal with and they put them onto someone else as a way of dealing with it. So a spouse being jealous or mistrustful because they're feeling tempted. Displacement. Whenever the source of your negative feelings is someone with power, or something that you can't help, our ego kind of needs to feel in control. And if it's something that we can't control or we can't deal with, we'll do it in other ways. So maybe your boss. Obviously, if you think your boss is a jerk, you can't tell him that because that'll get you fired, right? So what do? You tell your roommate that they're a jerk, because what's your roommate going to do, right? The example, unfortunately, in the slide is real. One of my college professors told me about it. They knew a person, and whenever they would come home and they had a bad day, he would kick the dog. Because they can't make their lives better, they can't vent or say what they want to the people in charge, so he kicks the dog because the dog is helpless. Not right, not fair, but it does happen. Reaction formation. Behaving the exact opposite of one's true feelings. The kind of, hey girl, hey, and then they turn around and walk away. Oh my God, I hate her. I can't stand her. Why do I have to be nice to her? You are trying to hide your true feelings and you're kind of overcompensating almost to a point. I hate to say that because actually we're going to talk about overcompensation here in a little bit. So scratch that. Pretend I didn't say that. Overcompensation is Adler. But what it is that you really don't like a person, but you don't want them to be able to tell that. So you're overly nice to them. Hopefully that makes sense. Regression is reversion to an immature pattern of behavior. So, maybe, you can't get your way, so you throw a temper tantrum like a child, or, that kind of whole, if I can't have it, no one can. So, maybe you're fighting over an iPod or something with your roommate or little brother or sister, I don't know. So, you just destroy it. Well, if I can't have it, neither can you. That very childlike behavior is an example of regression. It's worth to note, too, that's not just in behavior. Sometimes it can even surface in patterns of speech when people kind of go back to baby talk, stuff like that. And then identification is kind of that whole, don't you know who I am? The bolstering self-esteem by forming an imaginary or real alliance with some person or group. well, I belong to this club, so I'm untouchable. Just their group membership kind of bolsters their self-confidence and their self-esteem. Social cognitive perspective emphasizes relationships, environmental influences, individual behaviors, and mental processes that come together to form personality. Biological perspective, physiological and genetic factors kind of contribute to your personality and who you are. In the grand scheme of things, I am most likely not going to test on those, but it is worthy to note that just because Freud thought that personality happened this one way, he is not the end-all be-all. And we're definitely going to emphasize that here coming up. I'm talking about a few more perspectives that we do go a little bit more in depth with. Psychoanalytic perspective, we already talked about that. Behavioral, the way that they explain personality is through learning. So anytime that you helped another kid whenever you were a child and you got praised for that, that helped shape your personality into becoming someone who liked to be helpful because you enjoyed that recognition, you enjoyed that praise. And that learning, the learning theory is that encourages that behavior. It's a reinforcer. Humanistic perspective. The humanistic perspective is important because what we talk about is, first of all, humanistic perspective believes that everybody is kind of their own champion, that everybody has the answers to kind of all of their own problems, and that we're trying to reach our fullest potential. That we try and grow, and that the choices we make in life influence our personalities, and it really focuses on the positive aspects of human nature. A lot of people kind of believe in the whole tabula rasa thing, that we come out as a blank slate. Humanistic perspective is a bit more optimistic in that we're kind of all born good, and that sometimes, unfortunately, things just happen to detract from that. But that we all have unlimited potential, and that, we struggle to grow and become better people. Things to understand about Freud, I think we kind of already talked about that. Each stage is involved with a conflict. I kind of reversed those two, I apologize. 12 and 13 should be reversed. The psychosexual stages, we'll talk about that first. Your oral stage, so whenever you're a child, the first thing you can do, you're born, and then what can you do? Not a whole lot of anything. You're a baby, you're helpless. One thing you can do is feed. So the focus of this is you're learning how to feed yourself. Obviously, that would make your mouth very important, right? The goal of this, or how you, kind of the conflict of this stage, is breastfeeding. So weaning yourself off of the breast is kind of your hallmark that you've passed the oral stage of development. And what would happen is Freud would contend that people get hung up on these stages. And that if they do not, or if they're still struggling with something in the oral stage, they kind of develop a fixation. So that they may constantly bite their nails, or have something in their mouth, or constantly be eating, drinking, chewing gum, something like that. Your anal stage, so around age 2-3, you kind of start working on the whole potty training thing. And that's really your big hallmark conflict of this. And the way he thought that this surfaced in adulthood, if you had issues with this stage, maybe you're obsessed with cleanliness. So you're kind of, the term that they use is anal retentive. Everything has a place, and whenever something's out of place, you get very disturbed. Or conversely, maybe it goes the other way around, and that you haven't mastered this stage, so that you're overly messy. Something like that. Your phallic stage, age 4-5. This is where you kind of start becoming aware of the differences between boys and girls and the equipment down below. And, with that, Freud's big thing with this was that your mastery of this stage kind of depended on how your parents talk to you about the situation. Is this something that is shocking or provocative, and, we don't talk about it in this house? Because for Freud, that was kind of a signal, like, oh, well, they're going to be dealing with this part of their identity for a while, and that it could relate or kind of happen or manifest throughout promiscuous behavior or sexual curiosity, things like that. Your latency period is your 6 to 12 phase. This is where it becomes less about you and more about other people. How a lot of our identity is tied to the way other people see us and our self-esteem and our kind of understanding of who we are, and where we fit in with the world. And then your genital stage, which is adolescence onwards, where you start looking for a mate. Kind of rooted still in evolutional theory, and that to the point where this is where you start kind of worrying about obtaining a lifelong mate, the perspective of mating and having children at some point, stuff like that. And that's really kind of the end of that stage. Like I said, each stage is involved with a conflict that has to be resolved before one can go to the next stage. Failure to completely resolve that conflict can result in fixation. We talked about with the oral fixation or the anal fixation, that obsession with cleanliness. The Oedipal complex. So remember we talked about the iceberg and stuff buried way deep underneath the water. Kind of a more unpleasant aspect of this, talking about the Oedipal complex. So it's called either the Oedipal complex if it's a male, or the Electra complex if it's a female. But it is basically an unconscious desire. So something that we don't realize that we do, that Freud says that we do, and that we tend to strive to get the attention of the opposite sex parent to the point that we alienate or manifest feelings of resentment towards the same sex parent. In case you don't know the story of Oedipus, he gets thrown out of the village or something like that, and comes back and ends up marrying his mother. Kind of this thing that we have sexual feelings towards our parent. Again, he's not saying that that's like a conscious thing, that's like what's in our head, but the way that this manifests to more popular theories or more current theories is that is really our first understanding or our first interaction with, kind of a prospective mate, or a first kind of symbol of that. So, and it is true to a point in that science and research has shown that we tend to select mates that have similar characteristics to our opposite sex parent oftentimes. So it is very controversial in nature. It is not a blatant thing that you think about, but it is something that Freud manifested or maintained kind of influences our identity and our personality. Alfred Adler in Individual Psychology. So compared to Freud's idea that human motivations are sexual in nature, Adler believed that we have just a natural innate drive for superiority. So what this means is he deals with competences and inferiorities. So competences is something that you understand or that you're good at. And as babies, naturally, we are less confident because we can't do things for ourselves. As we grow, we develop competencies and competences and become better adjusted to life. So that whereas Freud kind of saw them as conflicts, he saw them as inferiorities. And as we grow and we develop, those inferiorities diminish and we become more whole and more confident. However, if you don't, he believed in something called an inferiority complex. Marilyn Monroe was one of his big examples of inferiority complexes. She had a pretty horrible relationship with her birth father. So he maintained that her status as a sex symbol and her kind of promiscuous behavior stemmed from her inferiorities with her father figure. So this is probably kind of sounding kind of weird to you guys. This is not really something that I can kind of explain one directionally, kind of unilaterally in this. But it's, whenever we talk about these things, it's not like, again, it's not a conscious thing. But what it does say is that our interactions as children help form our personality. More so with Freud, less so with Adler, but that's still not having those competencies will affect our personality and our behavior. Overcompensation is the ability or the effort to conceal inferiorities by acquiring status, exerting power over others, things like that. So, really good example of this is if you know about Napoleon. Napoleon was a fairly small guy, kind of shorter in stature. So he was kind of an example of overcompensation because he had smaller frame and was not, the most physical of people. He kind of took that out by conquering countries, things like that. So maybe you're not good with one thing. Maybe you're really, really bad with math. But you overcompensate for that. And you work in an area or a field where you don't have to use that skill as much. So, Carl Jung, main things I want you to know about Jung, he is a disciple of Freud. So most of his work is steeped in the psychoanalytic perspective. However, both he and Anna Freud, who was Sigmund Freud's daughter, both psychoanalysts, but also both really believed that Freud concentrated too much on sex. Huge surprise that someone would say that, right? Carl Jung founded analytical psychology. And he has this idea, he believed in the unconscious like Freud, but his wasn't, conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. It was a personal conscious and a collective unconscious. So we have these thoughts and feelings that are hidden beneath the surface that we don't realize, but that a lot of that comes from just us being human beings and our culture. So that we share these more ideas and concepts, and they're shown throughout figures and art and history. And one example of that is an archetype. An archetype is an emotionally charged image and thought form. So kind of someone covered in black hanging in the shadows. Most cultures, that kind of gives you a kind of sneaky vibe and puts you on edge and makes you feel uncomfortable. And that's something because that hiding, that sneaking, our collective unconscious recognizes that as a threat. Kind of the mother figure too. A mother figure, Darth Vader was one. I remember that actually from my college textbook. The kind of dark clothing, the struggle for power. It's an archetype, that kind of power-hungry persona being an archetype. Carl Rogers and the Self. Carl Rogers, deeply rooted in the humanistic perspective. He believed in unconditional positive regard. What unconditional positive regard teaches you is that you can disagree with someone's actions and still support them. So I don't agree with you, or I don't like what you're doing, but I still love you. Kind of that thing. Also talks about self-concept. So self-concept is just how we see ourselves, our kind of mental picture of ourselves. And then he also talks about the actual self, the ideal self, and the ought self. Actual self is who you actually are. Your ideal self would be who you are in a perfect world. And your ought self is kind of your bare minimum. Like what are your minimum expectations to be fulfilled and that you absolutely have to do. So again, that's humanistic perspective. That's page 401. And that continues on 402 with Carl Rogers. Also talks about conditions of worth. So the standards that an individual must live up to in order to receive regard from others or to feel like they've done something good. Julian Rotter and social learning theory. I'm not going to talk too much about that. What I will tell you is know about internal locus of control and external locus of control. So what can you help? What can you change? What can you do? That's your internal locus of control. Your external locus of control are things that you cannot control. And that's just the nature of life. There are some things you can do and some things that you can't. Social cognitive perspective, associated with Bandura, suggests that personality results from patterns of thinking as well as relationships with others. That's the social part of it. Self-efficacy. how effective someone feels they can be at something. Think it effect, efficacy. So how good you think you are at something, or how likely you think you are to achieve a goal. Surface traits and source traits. This is PowerPoint slide number 19. I'm not going to focus too much on that, but that you have surface traits. So things that people notice right away about you. Versus your source traits, which are things that people don't know about you the first time that they meet you. They may not be present in first impressions, but the more you know about them, the more you understand these things. So underlying foundation characteristic of personality. So, you can kind of just tell from shallow interactions if a person is nice or friendly or something like that, but why they are the way they are, you're looking more at source traits. 5-factor model of personality. McRae and Costa use the acronym OCEAN. So openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Openness is your willingness to try new activities or new concepts or new things. Conscientiousness is kind of, I tend to think as one's level of organization, how well they have things together. Routine plays a very high role in this, things like that. Extroversion is where you get your energy from. Do you like being around people? Do you draw energy from other people? Or do other people exhaust you? It's noteworthy to note with these that it is not a black or white dichotomous thing. These are usually looked at as spectrums. So the more open you are to a new experience, the higher you are in openness. Extroversion, the same thing. The more you like being around people, the higher you are in extroversion. Versus, if you are more of a loner, kind of more isolated, you may be lower in extroversion. Agreeableness. Those people who always want to make others happy, they tend to be very high in agreeableness. Whereas those people who are all about them, and it doesn't really matter what other people need or want, they tend to be lower in agreeableness. Neuroticism. One of the things that I don't really get to emphasize as much, because this is an online class, there's a pretty fine line between conscientiousness and neuroticism, in that conscientiousness, people who are higher in conscientiousness, they're organized and punctual and dependable, tend to be very well disciplined. Neuroticism are people who tend to manifest more in anxiety. So it tends to be less adaptive. And the thing is, conscientiousness, high levels of conscientiousness are actually correlated with very high levels of success, both personally and professionally. Whereas neuroticism is very highly correlated with medical disorders, psychological disorders, things like that, and tends to be exhibited as insecurities or vulnerabilities. I thought that was a pretty cool video that I went ahead and put with that too. Kind of gives you an example. Don't judge the C-3PO bit too harshly. I mean, that thing's older than I am, but it's still a pretty good example. The ability to follow rules. I think that's where it really, one of the strengths or one of the places that this lies. Conscientiousness, they may understand and recognize the rules, but they may also think that there are times that the rules need to be broken. Whereas people who are more neurotic, oh my God, I can't break a rule, this is what's going to happen. And it's just a very less adaptive feature of it. So, assessment. Talks a little bit about this. Validity is how much does your test measure what it claims to measure. If I give you an intelligence test, how do you know I'm really assessing for intelligence? Dr. Seuss has a great quote. If you judge a fish's ability to climb a tree, I don't remember the actual quote, feel free to put it up, but basically that everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses. How do we know that we're actually looking at what we're supposed to be looking at? Which for us, this can be anywhere from personality or intelligence to maybe ADHD. A lot of times whenever we screen for ADHD, we'll ask, how often do you complete a task? How often do you get distracted? Things like that. And what we're looking at is we're taking the diagnostic criteria of ADHD and putting it in question form. That way we know that's what we're looking at. On a target, did I put that on here? Oh, I don't think I did. Okay, I need to find it. So think about it in terms of a target. Your validity is hitting the bullseye. You are assessing what you truly want to assess. Okay? But if I give you an intelligence test in Mandarin, am I actually testing intelligence? No, I'm testing your ability to read and speak that language. So that's where culture fair assessment comes in. I think the book did a pretty good job of talking about that too. Reliability, in terms of a target, think about all of your shots being arrow or gunshots or whatever it is, whatever that you're throwing at this target, everything ends up to one side or the other. You're not hitting what you're trying to hit, but you're consistent. And that still counts for a lot in the world of psychology and testing and assessment. Because maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe it's a malfunction. Maybe it's a bad piece of equipment. We don't know. But that reliability still counts for a lot. Objective tests and personality test or projective tests. So an objective test is just like the multiple choice test that you're going to take at the testing center. You have a limited range of responses and you have to pick one. So it's objective. An example of that is going to be an MMPI or actually I said a TAP, but that was incorrect. Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, 16PF, MBTI. Those are all your pencil and paper tests are your objective tests. Now, your projective, did I just screw up and reverse that? I don't know. Objective tests, paper, pencil tests. Just remember that, okay? Projective test is going to be your Rorschach ink blocks. So I ask you, what do you see in this picture? So I put one on the slide and I'm like, okay, I kind of see two people working. I also see a weird, creepy smile in the middle. What that tells you, there are no right or wrong answers, but what that does is it helps you understand my experiences a little bit better. So, maybe I show you one and you're like, I see a cow. And I'm like, what? And I'm like, okay. But then as I get to know you, I learned that you work on a farm. Oh, I kind of see how that would be more in your thoughts than, maybe an account executive or something like that. And what it does is it helps you glean information about the person's life and experiences. So, that is it. That is all I got. I could honestly do this all day, but unfortunately, I can't. Hopefully, though, I was clear in that. Try to emphasize no validity, no reliability. Know the difference between an objective test and a projective test. Those things. As far as the perspectives or, kind of the different trait perspectives and things like that, know the 5-factor model. No humanistic perspective. No, definitely no psychodynamic and psychoanalytic. But those are really the things that I'm going to go deep in depth with. Bandura, social cognitive perspective, I'm not going to be asking so much about that. But it'll be in there. But I'm not testing really deep in depth on that. As far as the rest of it, Freud, McCrae and Co. stuff, 5 theory, that's the stuff that I'm really going to be going in depth with. Defense mechanisms too. So hopefully that helps give you a little bit better understanding. My goal is to get the study guide up this weekend. So fingers crossed. I will be working most of the weekend this weekend. So definitely if you need something, I will be online a lot and I'll be a lot more available this weekend. So by all means, please, if you need something, let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys later. I hope all is well. And